My name is Priya Iyer. I'm 31, a pediatric nurse in Sacramento, and until that Tuesday afternoon I believed I was 3 weeks away from marrying the most patient, steady man I'd ever met. Derek Callahan proposed on a hiking trail 8 months into dating, and everything since then had felt almost effortlessly easy. No red flags, no gut feelings, just a man who seemed to genuinely, uncomplicatedly love me. I was looking for winter blankets, not answers, when I opened that box. Beneath a folded quilt was a manila envelope, soft with age, and inside it, a California marriage certificate. Derek Callahan. Except the last name on the certificate wasn't Callahan at all. It was Renton. David Renton. Married 11 years ago, in Nevada, to a woman named Whitney Marsh. I stared at it for a long time before my brain accepted what my eyes were already telling me. Same face in the small attached photo, unmistakably younger, but unmistakably him. A different name. A different life. A wife I'd never once heard mentioned in 8 months of dating and 3 weeks of wedding planning. I called him at work, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Derek. Who is Whitney Marsh? The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. Where did you find that name? He said finally. Not a question, not surprise. A flat, careful statement, like a man confirming which specific lie had finally caught up to him. I had no idea, standing in our half-packed apartment with a wedding dress hanging 3 feet away, that I was about to spend the next several months untangling not one hidden marriage, but an entire pattern of them, and that the woman whose name I just stumbled onto would become, improbably, the person who helped me survive it. It's complicated, Derek said, when he finally came home that night, still in his work clothes, refusing to meet my eyes. Whitney and I got married young. It didn't work out. I always meant to deal with the paperwork properly, I just never got around to it. Never got around to it, I repeated. Derek, we're getting married in 3 weeks. You're still legally married to someone else. I'm going to fix it, he said. I promise you, Priya, this doesn't change anything between us. It changed everything. I spent that night in our guest room, staring at the ceiling, running through 8 months of memories, searching for a single moment where something had felt off and I'd talked myself out of noticing it. There wasn't one. That was almost the worst part. He hadn't just lied to me. He'd been extraordinarily good at it. I told my sister the next morning, and her reaction was the first thing that made me feel less like I was losing my mind. Priya, that's not a paperwork problem. That man is still married. You need to actually find out who this woman is before you decide anything. I hesitated for days before I let myself search Whitney Marsh's name online. What I found unsettled me more than the certificate itself. Old social media accounts that simply stopped posting 11 years ago, mid-sentence in some cases, no goodbye post, no explanation, just silence exactly around the time Derek said their marriage didn't work out. I didn't know, staring at a frozen decade-old photo of a woman smiling at a barbecue, she never seemed to have another normal day after, whether I was looking at someone who'd simply moved on with her life, or someone who'd disappeared in a way that had nothing to do with her own choice at all. I hired a private investigator the following week, a calm, thorough woman named Renata Osei, who didn't flinch when I laid the marriage certificate on her desk. Give me 10 days, she said. She came back in 6. David Renton is his legal name, Renata explained, sliding a folder across the desk. Derek Callahan is an alias, not identity theft, technically, since it's not another real person's identity, just an assumed name he's used consistently for the past 9 years, since shortly after he and Whitney separated. Is the divorce finalized? Anywhere. No filing exists in Nevada, California, or any adjoining state I could search. As far as any legal record shows, David Renton and Whitney Marsh are still married. My stomach turned over slowly. So legally, if we'd gotten married in 3 weeks. It wouldn't have been a legal marriage at all, Renata finished. Void from the start, whether either of you knew it or not. I sat with that for a long moment, grief tangling with something colder and more clarifying underneath it. I had spent 8 months planning a wedding to a man who was already, unknowingly to me, someone else's husband. There's something else, Renata said carefully. I found Whitney's current address. Small town outside Reno. And I found something in the public record that concerns me more than the unfinished divorce. What? A significant joint debt, opened the year before they separated, entirely under both their names. Over $60,000, still unpaid, still accruing interest. If she doesn't already know he's been living under a different name for 9 years, someone should probably tell her, because right now, she's the one legally on the hook for a debt he's clearly never intended to help pay off. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. Some part of me wanted to hate Whitney Marsh, an easy, uncomplicated place to put all of this, but the more I sat with what Renata found, the harder that became to justify. She wasn't the woman who'd deceived me. She was, as far as the evidence suggested, someone who'd been quietly abandoned by the same man 9 years before he did an even more sophisticated version of it to me. I wrote the message a dozen times before I finally sent it. This is going to sound strange, and I'm sorry to reach out of nowhere. My name is Priya. I recently found out I'm engaged to a man named David Renton, who's been going by Derek Callahan for the past 9 years. I believe you may still be legally married to him. I think we should talk. She called within 20 minutes. I've spent 9 years, Whitney said, voice tight and unsteady, wondering if he was dead. Wondering if I'd done something wrong. Wondering why he just stopped coming home one day and never came back, leaving me with debt I still can't fully pay off. And you're telling me he's been alive this whole time, using a different name, engaged to someone else. I'm so sorry, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. I had no idea you existed until 11 days ago. I believe you, Whitney said, quieter now. You sound exactly as blindsided as I did 9 years ago. We stayed on the phone for almost 2 hours, piecing together a timeline that made less and less sense the longer we talked. David disappearing from Whitney's life at almost the exact moment Derek Callahan resurfaced 300 miles away, a gap of only 6 weeks between one identity ending and the next one beginning, like he'd barely paused before starting over. I need to ask you something, Whitney finally said. Has he ever mentioned a woman named Camille? I felt my stomach drop before she even finished the sentence. I hadn't heard that name. But something in the careful, dreading way Whitney asked it told me I needed to find out fast. Renata confirmed it within 2 days. A third identity, Grant Ashworth, briefly married to a woman named Camille Duarte in Oregon, 4 years after Whitney, 4 years before me. That marriage, unlike the other 2, actually ended in a formal divorce filing, quiet and uncontested, roughly 18 months after it began. Divorced legally that time, Renata said. Which means, as far as any court record shows, he was legally married to Camille Duarte and Whitney Marsh simultaneously for at least several months before that divorce finalized, and now engaged to you, while still legally married to Whitney. I found Camille through the Oregon divorce filings attorney of record, and reached out the same way I'd reached Whitney, carefully, honestly, bracing for whatever reaction came back. Camille's response arrived within the hour. Not shock. Recognition. I always wondered if there were others, she wrote. He drained about $40,000 from a small inheritance during our marriage into an investment opportunity that never existed. I got out faster than I think the others did, because my father was a lawyer and helped me see the signs early. I'm so sorry you're both going through this. Tell me what you need from me. 3 women. 3 names. 3 separate lives quietly dismantled by the same careful, patient man, each identity ending right around the time the next one began, a pattern too precise, too deliberate, to be anything except a system he'd built and refined, one abandoned marriage at a time. I sat with my phone in my hands, feeling something shift inside me that wasn't only grief anymore. For the first time since finding that certificate, I understood exactly how much bigger this was than a single lie to a single woman. The three of us met in person for the first time at a diner exactly equidistant from all our homes, an unlikely reunion of women who'd never met, connected only by the careful architecture of one man's decade of reinvention. Whitney arrived first, older than her photos, carrying herself with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 9 years quietly wondering what she'd done wrong. Camille arrived sharp and organized, a legal pad already tucked under her arm. "I want to be very clear about something," Camille said, once we'd all settled in. "None of this is any of our faults. He is exceptionally good at this. That's not the same thing as us being careless." Whitney nodded slowly, like she needed to hear that from someone who wasn't her own therapist. "I spent years thinking I'd missed some obvious sign. Hearing both of you say the same thing helps more than I expected." We spent 3 hours mapping out everything we each knew: financial records, dates, aliases, the debt Whitney was still legally responsible for, the $40,000 Camille had lost, the wedding I'd nearly walked into as an unknowing accomplice to bigamy. "He's currently engaged to Priya under a fourth version of himself, essentially," Camille said, tapping her pen against the table. "Which means legally, right now, he's simultaneously still married to Whitney and pursuing a fraudulent marriage with Priya. And presumably already looking past me," I added quietly, "toward whoever comes next if none of us ever compared notes." Whitney reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. The same gesture, I realized with a strange jolt, that David's arm around my shoulders used to make me feel protected by, now offered instead by a stranger who understood exactly what this specific kind of blindsided grief felt like from the inside. "He built his whole system on us never finding each other," Whitney said. "So let's make sure that's the last time that works for him." We hired one attorney together, Marissa Chen, a family law specialist who'd handled bigamy cases before and didn't so much as blink at the scope of what we laid out for her. "Legally, this is fairly unambiguous," Marissa said. "David Renton never legally divorced Whitney. That makes his subsequent marriage to Camille void as well, regardless of the divorce filing they believed was legitimate, because you can't legally divorce from a marriage that was never properly ended in the first place, and Nevada's records show no valid termination of the Renton-Marsh marriage. Which means his engagement to Priya, had it proceeded, would have been entering into a fraudulent marriage on top of an already invalid one." "What about the money?" Whitney asked. "The debt. Camille's inheritance." "Financial fraud within a marriage carries real legal consequences, especially with a documented pattern across multiple identities," Marissa said. "This isn't just a messy personal situation anymore. This is felony-level bigamy and fraud, and the pattern itself, 3 women, 3 aliases, financial damage escalating each time, makes it significantly easier to prosecute than any single case would be alone." We spent the following week compiling everything into a formal package: Renata's identity research, Whitney's outstanding debt documentation, Camille's inheritance loss records, my own marriage certificate discovery, and filed it jointly with both Marissa's office and the district attorney handling financial fraud cases in the county where Derek Callahan currently resided. David had no idea any of this was happening. As far as he knew, Whitney was still a 9-year-old wound he'd successfully outrun. Camille was a quiet, uncontested divorce in his rearview mirror, and I was 3 weeks from an unwitting wedding that would have made me his third simultaneous, entirely fraudulent marriage. He had built an entire identity around the assumption that none of us would ever speak to each other. He was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. I confronted him myself, 2 days before the filing went through, not because Marissa recommended it, but because I needed to look him in the eye one last time before this became something neither of us could control the shape of anymore. We met at our apartment, the wedding dress I still hadn't returned hanging visibly in the open closet behind him. "I know about Whitney," I said. "I know about Camille. I know your real name is David Renton, and I know you were never actually divorced, which means this whole engagement was built on a lie before we'd even set a date." Something in his face shifted. Not shock, I realized, watching closely. Calculation. The same rapid practiced search for an angle I imagined Whitney and Camille had each watched cross his face at their own breaking points. "You don't understand the full situation," he started. "Whitney and I've talked to Whitney. I've talked to Camille. We've compared every date, every name, every dollar. There isn't a version of this you can explain your way out of anymore." For the first time in 8 months, I watched him run out of a rehearsed answer entirely. "What do you want from me?" he finally said, voice flat, all the warmth gone out of it now that performing warmth no longer served a purpose. "I want you to understand that the three of us aren't strangers to each other anymore," I said. "I want you to know that a formal fraud complaint was filed this morning, in 3 names, with 3 separate timelines that all point to the exact same pattern. And I want you to know that whatever version of yourself you plan on becoming next, it's going to be a lot harder to build in a world where the women you've hurt actually talk to each other." I set my engagement ring on the counter between us and walked out without waiting for whatever he said next. The investigation moved faster once it was formally filed with 3 coordinated timelines instead of 3 isolated, unconnected complaints. David was arrested 6 weeks later on charges of bigamy and financial fraud, the pattern across 3 states and 3 identities giving prosecutors exactly the kind of clear, escalating evidence Marissa had predicted would make the case. A 4th woman came forward during the investigation, someone he'd been quietly corresponding with online for 2 months under yet another name, a relationship that hadn't progressed far enough to cause financial damage, but confirmed exactly what all 3 of us had already suspected. He hadn't stopped. He'd simply been building the next version while still finishing the current one. Whitney's outstanding debt was formally separated from her name once the marriage was declared legally void from its actual termination point, a process that took months but eventually cleared 9 years of financial limbo she'd been quietly carrying alone. Camille's $40,000 was never fully recovered, but the fraud conviction gave her something she said mattered almost as much, an official, undeniable record that she hadn't imagined any of it, hadn't been careless, hadn't missed some obvious sign she should have caught. David took a plea deal rather than risk trial, given the strength of 3 separate, cross-referenced timelines. 2 years, reduced for cooperation, along with restitution orders neither Whitney nor Camille expected to see the full amount of, but which at least existed now, formally, on paper, backed by a system finally forced to see the whole pattern instead of one isolated case at a time. I never wore that wedding dress. I donated it eventually to a local nonprofit that resells them for women who need one and can't afford the cost. A strange, quiet kind of closure I hadn't expected to find meaningful until I actually felt it. Whitney, Camille, and I still talk most weeks, almost a year later, an odd, unlikely friendship built entirely out of the wreckage of a man none of us particularly want to think about anymore. We call it, half joking, half not, the club nobody wants to be in, and no one else quite understands. Whitney started dating again slowly, cautiously, 6 months after the case closed, someone patient enough to understand why background checks and shared bank statements from day one weren't paranoia, just hard-earned caution. Camille went back to school, finishing the law degree she'd paused years earlier during her own marriage, drawn, she says, toward exactly the kind of fraud cases that once nearly broke her. I moved out of the apartment David and I shared, into a small place of my own I picked without needing anyone else's approval on the paint color or the furniture. I kept nursing, the one part of my life that had never once been touched by any of this, and found, surprising myself, that I trusted my own judgment more now than I had before any of it happened, not less, the way I'd feared I would. We meet in person twice a year now, the 3 of us, at the same halfway point diner where we first sat across from each other as strangers connected only by one man's careful architecture of lies. Last time, Whitney brought a photo of the apartment building where David had been arrested, not out of cruelty, she said, but because looking at it together, all three of us in the same room, finally felt like something closer to closure than any of us had managed alone. I think often about the version of this story where I never opened that box looking for winter blankets, where I married a man I believed I knew completely, unaware he was already, at that exact moment, legally bound to someone else 300 miles away. I think about how close that version came to being my actual life. What saved me wasn't cleverness, or suspicion, or some sixth sense I'm proud of. It was luck, mostly, a closet, a box, a receipt for honesty I never asked for but happened to stumble into 3 weeks before it would have been too late to matter. What I did with that luck, though, reaching out to a stranger instead of quietly disappearing from the situation alone, choosing solidarity over the easier, more comfortable instinct to treat another woman as a rival, that part I'm proud of. Whitney once told me that the version of herself who spent 9 years alone, believing she'd simply been left, wouldn't recognize the version of herself sitting across from me now, laughing at a diner table with 2 women she was never supposed to meet. I understand exactly what she means. I don't recognize the version of myself who almost walked down an aisle 3 weeks after finding that certificate either, if I'd let fear or embarrassment keep me quiet instead of curious. If you discovered, right before your wedding, that your fiancé was already secretly married to someone else, would you have reached out to that woman, the way I did, or would it have felt safer to walk away and never look back? If Priya's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real emotional journeys.